So, thanks for joining me here and welcome. In next, let's say, 45 minutes, we'll be talking about developing websites with Magnolia and Ruby on Rails. Perhaps before we get started, just a question. I figured that not all of you have deep Ruby on Rails experience. How many of you have ever worked with Rails at all? One of you. Two. That's pretty much as I expected. Since we're here on the technical track, you will actually see some code. I think it should be quite easy to understand, even if you don't have that extensive Ruby experience. And if there are any questions, please just let me know. So, then let's get started. The talk was titled Integrating Magnolia with Ruby on Rails. But actually, I'm not really talking about Ruby on Rails. What I'm really talking about is how to integrate Magnolia with a rich and comprehensive web framework. And in this regard, I attended the talk of Tobias this morning. I don't know if he's here. And I think we pretty much up there. We pretty much addressed, or I think we pretty much had the same pain points, and we addressed the same questions. With Blossom, you solve these problems with the Spring framework. We've chosen Rails, but many of the problems, many of the issues are more or less the same. So, what we're going to cover. First, I want to talk about our approach, what was important for us. Then I'll give you a quick introduction in how to run a Rails app actually within Magnolia. Then I'll try to give a quick case study on how to develop a very, very simple application with Magnolia and Rails. And then I'll talk about some testing and some ecosystem stuff, but that's basically it. And when I want to get started with the approach, or with our approach, it might be necessary for you to understand where we come from. Dievision is an agency. We got 2 offices in Berlin and in Hanover. We employ roughly about 35 people. Some of them are here. And these are some of our clients we work for. So, this is basically our background. We're an agency, we do much of client work, what we wanted to achieve with this solution, I'll show you later on, is we basically wanted to create an environment which our clients enjoy to work with, and for which our developers really love to develop for. Since most of our clients' interaction with our work is done via the CMS, CMS is Magnolia in this case, and Magnolia, as we all know, is pretty user-friendly, and most of our clients really enjoy working with Magnolia. So this case is covered, and then let's try to figure out what are the requirements, or what have been the requirements, at least for our developers. What did they want? At first, and here we are back again in the talk this morning about the Blossom integration, we wanted to have a clean and consistent MVC architecture for the whole application. And what was really important for us due to the nature of our work, that this architecture can be applied not only to a largely content-driven site you manage with Magnolia, but also to sites we develop for other clients that might be more or less application-driven, that have only a small portion that's powered by a content management system, and the rest is powered by some application stuff. And we wanted to, and for all these kinds of applications, we wanted to use basically the same kind of architecture. Second thing, we wanted to use a file-based configuration, and we wanted to use file-based application data. Again, I see the parallels to the Blossom talk this morning, not because we prefer using files, but what's really important to us is have all the data, all the configuration in version control, being able to edit them with the proper tools. And this was really, really important for us. And then, you know, as an agency, we have to develop as efficient as possible. And so we want to invent as few wheels as possible. And when you start developing your typical web application, there are lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of things you have to think about that can be relevant for the application or might not be relevant for the application. And having all these different topics quite neatly integrated into one single stack was something that we really liked. So for other people, Spring might be a good answer to this set of problems. For us, it was Rails. And when we see the development process, or how our developers see the work in our application, our developers usually work more or less only with Rails or within the Rails infrastructure. Our clients are using Magnolia to edit the content. They're comfortable with this, and all is fine. And since Magnolia writes the content into the JCR repository, we are basically accessing this repository. We don't deal too much with Magnolia from a development point of view, of course a bit as well, but mainly we are using the JCR repository as a kind of data source, and we don't care that much about the rest. So when you're looking at this kind of architecture from a quite distant point of view, we are basically treating Magnolia as a kind of hierarchical NoSQL store that can be edited by normal people. And that way, the CMS itself is pretty much abstracted from the development process. By doing this, we can basically develop in the same way for JCR repository, for traditional SQL database, which is the root of the Rails framework, for other data stores, and within this infrastructure, we're also able to quickly prototype applications that probably use only some templating and no data store at all. So that's basically the architectural approach. When we are using Rails in combination with Magnolia, we obviously have to use Java. And there is a very good Java implementation of the Ruby language. It's called JRuby. JRuby is a 100% Java-based Ruby implementation. It's a pretty major project. It's said to be the fastest implementation of the Ruby 1.8 release. And it can be used or its web apps can be used or can be deployed in standard servlet containers. So you can basically take a Ruby app and deploy them to Tomcat or to whatever standard Java application server you're using. How is this done? Your typical Java application, the request goes through a set of filters. For JRuby, there exists a special project. It's called JRuby Rack. And Rack is the Ruby equivalent of the servlet standard. All major Ruby applications are developed for the Rack stack, and all major Ruby web servers, they expose this interface. So basically, this filter takes the Java request, transforms it a bit, and then gives it to via this transforms it to the RAG interface, and then gives it to the RAG-based web application. And Rails is nothing different than a RAG application. So when you're deploying a web app or a Ruby-based web app in a standard Java environment, you basically have two choices. First, you can use just a regular Java servlet container, and I'm simplifying a bit, but you can put the path of the Ruby application mainly in the webinf directory. When you do this, when you have this filter employed, then your RAG application is loaded and can be accessed. There are a couple of projects that are using or they are setting up Java servlet containers in a special way that makes it easier for Ruby-focused developers to work with these servers. One of these projects is Trinidad, and I want to show you, give you just a quick example of how to install a Magnolia-based Ruby app in this Trinidad server. So let's get started. So you basically you start by creating a standard new Rails app, providing you have Rails installed. You switch to this directory, and then you install in this Rails app, you install two plugins. The first plugin I'm installing here is basically, these are basically the Magnolia jars wrapped in this Rails plugin structure. Then we got a second plugin which exposes or which contains all the functionality we have and which I'll explain later to you. Once these plugins are installed, there we are. You run a generator, which basically moves the files, the jars, as you can see, in the right places. Then we added a configuration file. And we say, okay, we don't want to use this standard database. There we go. And then we have the standard, this is a standard Rails directory structure. And then we can start a server. And as you can see, a Tomcat server starts up. Starts. Finally, it's loaded. And you see the new Magnolia installation. And then I can go to localhost, it's on port 3000. I can run the standard installation process. A couple of seconds, there we are. We can start up Magnolia. We're ready to log in, as you know. So, and now I've got my just an empty Magnolia app running, and here you see we got two modules included in this file structure. First is the Rails website, which is basically a module to store templates, dialogues, paragraphs, as you know. Second is this Cynicum plugin, which this Cynicum module, which is the name of the module, which just provides some basic functionality for the Rails integration. What's also done during this installation process is that we create some new filters. As you see here, we have the Rails filter, and we got different version of the aggregator and the rendering filter. They are doing things a bit different than the standard filters, and they basically allow Rails to run as it is expected. So, and after this short installation process, we're ready to go. I'll move back to this filter model. As I said, we got the Magnolia filter chain added, or we add a few filters to this, and then we can connect our regular Rails application to our Magnolia app. In the simplest case, we have a Rails, let's say, base controller, which exposes the standard Magnolia content objects that are normally used for templating. The content object, the page object, the state object. And we provide some basic mapping between Magnolia's template and the Rails equivalent, which are called layouts. So I can show you the code that's needed to get the most basic application at all running. Within the Rails application, we have a file called routes.rb, which defines the mapping of a URL to a controller. It's basically Spring does the same thing in a bit different way. And here we say we want to match everything, and we want to handle all requests with this base controller and the index method. This standard controller provided by the module is just very simple. And then, when in Magnolia we have a template called homepage, this is mapped to the Rails infrastructure to a directory called layouts. There are all the layout definitions, and then we have a file, or we have to define a file called homepage.html.erb, and then we have the code for the template. As you can see here in this template, there are some things. This syntax might look a bit strange for you, since it's the Ruby ERB syntax, but there are also some things you might find familiar. We got this main bar, this edit bar. It's a bit different, but we can include them as well. And they are these, as they are called in Rails, these helpers are basically just mappers to the Magnolia taglet and provide the same green bars you're used to in your, let's say, conventional Magnolia app. This CMS out or a similar tag is provided by the standard taglets as well. I here just spit out the title attribute of the content. So this is the most simplest way we can get a Rails-based app running. We just provide this default controller, and then we are ready to start with our templating. As I said, you saw this module that's added to Magnolia, and this module provides a set of functionality. The first thing is the obvious JRuby and Reg integration. Then we got some support for the different aspects of the development process. For the controller, as I showed you, we got a base controller that makes it easier to work with Magnolia's content objects within Rails. We got these helpers that basically match the taglet. And then on the model side, we actually got the most complex features. All the other features, these are just a few classes and a couple hundred lines of code. It's not that much. Here we are providing a kind of a JCR wrapper with Ruby's semantics. Since also in this Rails application, we are basically working with Magnolia's content objects. We got content objects, we have node data, and so on, and so on, and so on. But what's not so nice, you could work directly with these objects, and you could use the interface directly. But when you're working in another language, it's not that nice to just go backward to another language every time you want to accomplish something. And that's why we're basically mapping the core functionality of the content interface, of the node data interface that you know, to a syntax, to conventions that are more accepted, or that are the way of doing things in the Ruby world. The second thing we have is a kind of an active record, like let's say a content or repository object mapper. Active record is the Hibernate equivalent in the Ruby world. It basically is an object relational mapper. It has some kind of interesting features, and it's quite commonly used in the Rails world. And so we created at least a subset of this functionality in the plugin, so that you're able to use content objects. You can fetch objects, you can query objects, you can save objects, you can delete objects, and so on, within a Ruby. You can do this in the Ruby way, so to speak. And the third thing is we have a file-based configuration, which I'll show you later on. Then, probably as the last layer, we have some utilities for the scheduler, for imaging, for testing, and that's pretty much it. So, I know now that I gave you a quick overview of the functionality, I want to show you how this works in action. And so I prepared a very, 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 very simple task that I'll show you how you can solve this within this Rails context. So the task is pretty simple. We got a page, this is a home page, and on the home page we want to display some press releases. Just a regular requirement. And these press releases, we have to, for the display of these press releases, we have to implement two features. The first thing is we want to display either just the regular title of this press release, or if there are a special shortened version of this title, we want to use this shortened version. Second, we want to display only the releases on the homepage that are explicitly shall appear on the homepage. It's the way it's implemented in Magnolia. It's quite obvious. You create a dialog. You say, okay, want to display it on the homepage, and I can define an alternative title. Pretty simple. So what you're doing in Rails or in Ruby, we got when you create a template. These templates are automatically mapped to an object in the this is the templates package, and this is the class press release. So when I create a template that's called press release, the system automatically looks, do I have in the package templates a class called press release? And if this is the case, all is fine, then I use this class for the object. Otherwise, I use a very simple default implementation. In this class, you see this is a regular class. It doesn't inherit anything, but you include, with this include statement, this is some kind of, when I go back to Java world, I would say extend or something. It includes a base class which provides the functionality we need for these model classes. And then in this model class, I define the method I want to use. I call it title homepage, and here I say I want to use the short version of the title, or if this is not defined, the regular title. And that's basically all you have to do to implement the first requirement. Use the short version, or if it's not available, use the longer version. So you might wonder, when I say title short and title, where do these attributes or these methods come from? They are automatically added to this class via the template's dialog definition. So when you define a template dialog, and you define properties called title short, these properties are automatically added as methods to the respective object. And so I can use these methods in my class, even though I don't explicitly have to define them. By doing this, I only have to define the attributes of my models, of my dialogues, of my paragraphs. I only have to define them once in my configuration, and they are automatically taken from this configuration and put into my object. I don't have to work to keep them in sync. Okay, so I solved my first requirement. I have this very simple logic for my title tag for the press release. The next thing I want to do, these press releases, they are not defined on the homepage, so I have to query for these releases. And so the homepage is on the, it has the URL /en. And so again, in my routes file, I define a route, as it's called in Rails. I say when the request matches the en URL, I don't want to use my default controller, but I want to use my home controller, again, with the index method. This is the way my home controller looks. Home controller, it inherits from my base controller. And then I define my index method, which is just a call to CMS render, which this CMS render method basically says render as you normally would in Magnolia. And then in my, here we are, sorry. So then I use, I go back. In this version of the controller, I would use this controller, but I still wouldn't have my press releases. So I actually have to query for these releases. And so I add to this controller my the query. Again, I use the model of my press release templates, and I use a method called for homepage, which I'll show you later. This is just the method, get me all the press releases, or get me the press releases I want to show on the homepage. I put them in an instance variable, and then in a template, I can say for all my releases, put a link to it to the this is again the press release object. I can query my title homepage method I defined earlier, and I automatically can add a link to this release by giving the actual object as a second argument. So here I got the controller, and I've got the view. The thing that's missing is the query method. And for this, I'm coming back to the model. And here I show you the implementation of the for homepage method. I say I want to have all objects where my show on homepage attribute, which I defined in the dialog, is true. I want to order them by release date and by order per day, and I always want to show 2 releases on the homepage. This strange syntax is actually this is the object relational or object content mapper in action. You could use a classic XPath or SQL query, but by using this object relational syntax, you can build very nice queries in a very intuitive way. And basically, for implementing this stuff, we are using reusing a third-party library which also powers the query engine in Active Record. We are only mapping we're mapping this information to a query that the repository is actually able to understand. So this is one way of implementing it. Here I have another way. You can make it even shorter, but this would lead too far, I think. So, and this is basically the way you would handle this very small problem in a Rails application. I think what I've shown you here is that we have a kind of clean separation between the different layers with all the information that belongs in a model, that is in a model. We have all the, let's say, the glue code in the controller, and the view is handles only the view things. The second thing I want to mention is the configuration part. What's important for the configuration for me is that it's consistent, that it's editable, that it's version controllable, and that it has. I have to be able to tie my configuration to the models, because as you saw, my models are automatically extended by the definitions of templates, of dialogues, and so on. And that's the reason why I'm not really happy with keeping the configuration in the admin interface, because I have to run Magnolia to access them. The standard serialization format is not so friendly to edit as well. So what we've done is we created we basically read a simple a YAML configuration file where we can define dialogues, templates, and paragraphs. So as you can see, basically here I define my video dialogue, I define several properties, I define the tabs, and all these attributes are read and mapped to the respective information in Magnolia. So basically, at the appropriate time, this information gets read out, and the information that's in Magnolia is updated with the information we have in the configuration file. So that was basically a rundown of the way we are developing the applications, or the applications with Rails. What I want to stress a bit, and that's the last part for me, is the testing. As I said in the beginning of the talk, what was important for us that we have a very comprehensive stack that encompasses all the regular features you want to use in your web app. And testing is a big part of this as well. And you got a pretty decent testing integration into Rails, and we can use this. You can have unit testing, as you're probably used to. But what I want to show you here is a different aspect. I want to show you how to test a view. And to do this, I want to continue with this homepage example. So on my homepage, I have my press releases. And what I want to test for is, are these press releases actually in the template? Are they read out? Are they there? So, and I can do this by using this test. For testing in Rails or in Ruby, you basically got two major test frameworks. The first thing is test unit, which is pretty similar to JUnit, for example. The other one is RSpec, which is a behavior-driven testing framework, which also has a pretty nice DSL that you can use for your test. I want to show you how to develop this test. So what I'm doing here, say I want to describe my homepage template, and I want to ensure that it displays the title of a press release on the template. So by doing this, I want to render my template, and then I say the result of this rendering should contain the words Sustainability World Index, which was the title of my press release. And when I run this test, actually the Rails rendering process is triggered, and the template is rendered, and I can verify if the information is on the template. So this test would obviously fail, since where does it get this information from? It's just not there. So to provide this or to provide my template with a press release, I have to create a press release object. And by doing this, I just create an instance of the model class I defined early on. I say I want to create a new press release with the attributes title and with an attribute title short. This syntax actually creates an instance of this class, and I don't have to be tied to a repository. I don't have this. This repository doesn't have to be running. It just works independent from it as well. So I can use these, since these are just plain objects, I can use them in my tests without any further thinking. So, but what I have in my template, when I fetch my releases in the actual use case, I have an array, which are these braces, an array of releases, and then I assign these releases to the instance variable I defined in the controller, and this test actually would pass. I create a press release, assign this press release to the instance variable I normally define in the controller, then I render the template, and then I can verify if the right words exist in the template. I also have the ability to test for more complex things. I actually would like to test if I have a link which has a certain class, which has a which links to a certain URL, and then this link should contain this text. This would be a more complex definition of a more complex test for objects I want to locate in a view. But these things tend to be more these things can get pretty complex, and I want to stay simple here. What's actually not so nice in this test is that I have to define my, let's say, my dummy, my mock press release within this test. And this might be just an appropriate solution in this single test here. But as the test suite grows and grows and grows and grows, I would have to define this mock template again and again and again. And here I define only 2 attributes. Usually I will have more attributes, more complex objects, and this would be quite tedious. And that's not something I want to do. So the way you would solve this is you would use a kind of factory which creates this model for me. And I want to run this factory and assign this release to the releases instance variable before I run each test. And so I have this section which is run before each test, and then my actual test can be very small, very concise, and just the way it should be. Here I got the factory definition. We are using, for this, we're using a framework called Factory Girl, which actually provides a lot of helper stuff to make it really easy to create these kinds of objects. And here what I say, I want to define a factory which creates an object which has the name sustainability release and which I can use then by this name in as many tests as I would like to do. So that's basically a rundown of everything a regular application has. We have the models, we have the user, we have the controllers, we do test them. And so I think that's what I can show you for this short session. One thing I just want to add is probably our conclusion or our experience with this approach. What we find that this development environment is, or at least for us, it's very, very, very productive. As you saw, the code is very concise. We don't repeat ourselves very much, and it's really great. And it's actually quite scalable between, and not scalable to hundreds and millions and thousands of users, but to very different kinds of projects. I can do very simple projects with it. I can add Magnolia as a CMS when I need one, but I can use much of the same approach with projects that are probably not that content-driven. And so I have the same set of tools, the same set of methodologies, which I can apply to a very broad range of projects, and in every case it feels just right. One thing many people might ask when we're talking about integrating Magnolia and with the whole Rails framework, how does this perform? Isn't it very slow? It's using this interpreted language, and so on and so on. But performance is just not an issue at all. Performance is just fine. It adds a bit of overhead to each request, that's true. But what we found that the actual limitation you run into are, that's nothing surprising, are queries to the repository. When you've got complex queries, when you've got lots of complex queries, performance starts to degrade, and the whole Rails thing is not an issue at all. What really is important for our, or what just benefits of productivity is that you save the whole save, compile, restart, reload process. You basically just save a class, you reload your browser, and you're done. And over the time, it's a huge benefit. And another thing that was really great for us, at least, is that our whole team basically uses the same kind of tools. In a traditional Java-based project, the backend developers using a full-fledged IDE, which is quite hard to understand, but just not really accessible for the front-end people. In this approach, many of our people are using the same tools, the same editors, and this makes collaboration much easier, switching between the different layers of an application. And so everyone is much more in the same boat, and you don't have this, oh, this is just some stuff I cannot edit anyway, so I don't want to touch it and I don't want to see it. And this is a huge benefit as well. So I hope you gained some insights. I hope you found it a bit interesting. And if there are any questions, please just let me know. He asked whether we are thinking about open sourcing all this. Yes, we're doing. We're actually planning to open source it in the next couple of weeks. Then, in case anyone is interested, just let me know. The question was if it's correct that the Ruby application is the leading application which resolves the URL on its own. Yes, that's basically true. To be more correct would be the request first goes through Magnolia, and then you can do all kinds of security checks and so on and so on. And then the request is handled back to the Ruby application, And at this time, every request, regardless if it's matched by a Magnolia object or not, is handled to the Ruby application, and then the Ruby application does completely its own thing. So, to answer your question, the Ruby application is in control, but you cannot avoid, for example, Magnolia security measures. They are executed every request as well.
Does this imply that you can mix Ruby application with standard Magnolia application?
Absolutely. That's just the you can when you have the standard when you have your standard Rails application, you just can define some routes that lead to the to Magnolia, and then you can run the application unless you're actually requesting these URLs. You can run these applications completely without Magnolia, develop this application stuff, and then on the deployment server you can add Magnolia back to the picture. The question was basically the relation of the templates we've seen before with the administering interface in Magnolia and so on and so on. I'll try to clarify the templating issue. So basically, when you're developing an application in this way, you're only using what's called a template in Magnolia is automatically mapped to a layout in Rails. So what you're doing is when you define your regular Magnolia template, you do your thing, and this information is then taken by this default controller and mapped to the Rails layout. So you're only working in Rails layouts and Rails partials and so on and so on, but they are mapped to the Magnolia definitions, and you can use the green bars on them and so on and so on. So this is just seamlessly integrated.
So the editorial users have a preview that comes from Ruby?
Exactly. So probably I want to show you this. I had this in my presentation. What you see here is exactly this Ruby layout and the Ruby partials and so on. It's just the view is completely rendered by Ruby. The question was about the SDK and if we can use parts of the SDK or if we have rewritten the SDK. Currently, we cannot use the SDK since we are limited to these Ruby views, and we cannot right now. I think it's possible to do this, but we haven't done this so far. What is possible, and we haven't rewritten the SDK, and we haven't rewritten parts of the SDK. But what you can do, and what we have done, is that we can. I've shown you these. Dialog configuration files. You can actually place these dialog configuration files in your app and in libraries that you can reuse between multiple apps. This goes for these definition. Same goes for templates. The same goes for controllers and so on and so on. So you are able to build a very reusable template, partial layout view structure using this infrastructure. I think it would be some work to match the SDK, but this can be done, and this is actively done by us to reuse code between projects and not to, what I said earlier on, we don't want to reinvent the wheel every time. And this is a large part of this. I think that's it for this session. And I think all of us are hungry. And